Hello and welcome to Owning the Narrative. I am Bulow. The show will feature the top news of the week, complete with my observations, and even a little bit of sarcasm thrown in. The top news stories will be taken from my morning news briefings that I write on the Rick Bulow New Media blog every weekday morning. If you go on to like what you see, smash that thumbs up button. And now, let's go right into the news. In a shocking move by big technology last week, Twitter had suspended an account of a free speech group without any explanation. This coming from my good friends over at the Daily Signal. The Twitter account for a national free speech organization has been suspended for allegedly violating Twitter's rules, but the group's president says she has no idea why the account would be suspended. I looked at all the tweets that I approved for the couple of days before, and nothing is like doxing anybody. Nicole Neely, Speech First president, told the Daily News in an interview last Tuesday. Doxing is the publishing of private or identifying information about an individual on the internet, usually with malicious intent. A national organization which works to promote free speech on campuses, in the media, and in the courts had its Twitter account suspended on February 8th. I've read the terms of service and you might be suspended, and literally nothing lines up, Neely said. It was like we were sharing news articles, nothing controversial, not like, flat earthing or COVID denying or any of that stuff. So it's like a total mystery today. On January 8th, Twitter permanently suspended the account of former President Donald Trump. Other conservatives' accounts on Twitter have since been suspended, among them the account of Project Veritas, a conservative-leaning undercover reporting organization. It was suspended on Thursday for repeated violations of Twitter's private information policy, a Twitter spokesman said according to Politico. The Twitter account for the Job Creators Network, a nonpartisan organization that supports small businesses, business leaders, and entrepreneurs, was suspended for what Twitter called violating rules against platform manipulation and spam. WCIV TV Channel 4, the ABC affiliate in Charleston, South Carolina, reported. Laura Rees, director of the Center for Technology Policy at the Heritage Foundation's Davis Institute for National Security and Foreign Policy, told the Daily Signal in an email that speech first deserves an explanation. The very first line of the Twitter rules states, Twitter's purpose is to serve the public conversation, Rees said. Twitter also states in its introduction to its rules that our rules are meant to ensure all people can participate in the public conversation freely and safely. Rees added, Twitter's actions indicate otherwise. What possible reason would Twitter have for suspending the account of Speech First, an organization to promote free speech on campuses? Twitter policies also indicate that when it permanently suspends an account, it, number one, notifies the account holder. Two, explains what policy or policies were violated by what content. And three, permits violators to appeal the suspension. Twitter is not following its own process. The company owes Speech First an explanation and an appeal. The suspension and lack of promise process by Twitter compounds the belief held by many that the company is censoring conservative speech. The Daily Signal contacted Twitter, and according to a spokesperson for the platform, Twitter said it permanently suspended the account referenced under our platform manipulation and spam policy and was part of a larger investigation. Twitter cited the platform manipulation and spam policy, referencing this section that says users cannot take part in coordinated activity that attempts to artificially influence conversations through the use of multiple accounts, fake accounts, automation, and or scripting. Neely said that the experience has illustrated for her the power that the tech titans have. What's kind of sad and frustrates me is we haven't really weighed into the whole debate over big tech censorship of conservative organizations, she said, adding, I have friends who work at Facebook, I have friends who work at Twitter, and so I really kind of bent over backwards to give tech companies the benefit of the doubt on this. I do believe that they are private platforms. They're allowed to set the rules of engagement. Like if I were to have a dinner party and someone wants to come over and start screaming at my guests, like I'm within my rights to tell them, but the fact that they're not living up to the purported terms of the deal, I think is frustrating. And she's totally right there. I mean, okay. Every month or so, I get a, a publication from Hillsdale College called In Primis. And that article and the article that I'm about to read next goes right into what this says. And I might get into it in a future video, not for the weekend review, but for another type of video. It says, who's in control? The need to rein in big tech. And it's fairly long, so I might just break it down into a few parts, kind of serialize it, but definitely stay tuned for that. Now along the line with big tech, the Democratic critics of big tech discuss ways to strike back with the White House. This coming from Reuters.com, and it's an exclusive by Nandita Bose and Jared Renshaw. Congressional Democrats have begun discussions with the White House on ways to crack down on big tech, including making social media companies accountable for the spread of disinformation on matters such as the U.S. Capitol Riot and addressing the abuse of market power to harm corporate rivals. The conversations, described by a lawmaker and congressional aides, have included the contentious topic of what to do with the measure called Section 230, part of a 1996 law called the Communications Decency Act, that shields social media platforms from lawsuits over much of their content posted by users. Democrat President Joe Biden, as a candidate last year, called for revoking Section 230, and his Republican predecessor, Donald Trump, unsuccessfully pressed Congress to repeal it. Many lawmakers in recent years have called for laws and regulations to rein in dominant tech companies such as Facebook Inc., Twitter Inc., Alphabet Inc., Google, Amazon.com Inc., and Apple Inc. Democratic lawmakers have expressed alarm over social media's role in the lead-up to a pro-Trump mob's January 6th attack on the Capitol. The conversations between lawmakers and Biden aides represent that the first sign that the White House has begun actively getting involved in considering how to take on big tech. And they also show how lawmakers are trying to get Biden staffers on board as part of the lengthy lawmaking process on a wide range of issues. By the way, Biden took office on January 20th. Democrat Representative Tom Malinowski, a member of the House of Representatives Homeland Security Committee, said that he has begun conversations with the White House on how to hold large social media platforms accountable for amplifying radicalizing content that triggers violence. Malinowski said he discussed legislation that he sponsored last year, which would hold these companies legally liable if they actively promote content using algorithms or designed to increase profits and readership that leads to violence. This is a priority for me, and we have had preliminary conversations with the White House on a path forward, Malinowski said. Malinowski's legislation would amend but not revoke Section 230. Several congressional aides, speaking on condition of anonymity, said members of Biden's team are listening to concerns raised by lawmakers on issues involving big tech, asking questions and participating in conversations about potential future action. The White House declined comment on these discussions. Democrat Representative David Cicilline, chairman of the House Judiciary Committee's Antitrust Subcommittee, has raised with the White House the question or the topic of more stringent antitrust enforcement against big tech. A source familiar with the matter said, a Cicilline spokesman declined comment. Based on Cicilline's previous public state comments, that committee actively pursues legislation based on recommendations from his subcommittee's 400-page October report into the state of competition in the digital community including business practices of Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. Some antitrust experts said that this could also mean broadening the Justice Department's October lawsuit that accused Google of misusing its market power to crush rivals, addressing Section 230. Aides to Democrat Senator Ron Wyden, a co-author of Section 230, have spoken to the White House about reforming the provision, a Wyden aide said. Those talks, the aide added, were aimed at a deliberate approach to reforming the law rather than repealing it. We have conveyed Senator Biden's view that it would be tremendously harmful to repeal or change 230 without great cause, the aide said. Now, Republican lawmakers, including Trump allies, Senator Josh Hawley, have pushed for repealing Section 230 and have accused tech companies of censoring the views of conservatives. Biden aides, speaking on condition of anonymity, have previously said that he is open to debate on how to reform Section 230. Dumping it was so important to Trump that he vetoed $740 billion in defense policy legislation in December because lawmakers had not heeded his demand for language repealing Section 230, a veto Congress later overrode. Trump was angered after Twitter and cracking down on election misinformation. Labeled some of his posts as containing disputed or misleading content. Twitter in January banned Trump's account. Biden's aides have circulated material among Senate Democrats to try to build consensus on changing but not dumping Section 230. A separate congressional source familiar with the material said. A Biden spokesman declined comment. Now, another Democrat, Representative Jackie Speer, plans to speak with the White House about the spread of disinformation, gender-based attacks online, and steps toward content moderation, a Speer aide said. Speer has already sent Biden a letter urging him to declare white supremacy a national security threat. Scott Wallstein, president of the Washington-based Technology Policy Institute think tank, said the conversations involving lawmakers and Biden aides can inform the president's thinking on issues related to tech, and at the very least get White House advisors thinking about what needs to be done. I think they're trying to develop a more thought-out position, Wallstein said of White House officials, but I must add, a lot of this will take time. Nothing in terms of policy positions will be immediate. And that's true. I mean, there's a whole lot of conservatives being basically banned or blackballed from so many social media outlets, as a matter of fact. And as I had brought up before, I have my own, I have my name posted everywhere on social media, and just just getting my name and my brand out there. So if you do want to find where I'm located on social media, you can do so right here on my contact information. I have email, social media. I'm on Quora, Twitter, Tumblr, MeWe, Gab, Parler, USA Life, Orbeez, YourSpot, WeGo, Wimkin, Cloud Hub, Uber, Kraken. There's also one called Gitmo Life that I'm on, also Connect Zing. And I'm on various video platforms like YouTube, BitChute, Dailymotion, Vimeo, Twitch, DLive, Via, Metacat, Brand New Tube. And I have my own server over on Gilded, which is kind of like Discord. So definitely check them out when you have a chance. The link is in the description below. And speaking of videos, this goes right along with it. As former President Donald Trump is quitting billionaire backers as he plans a conservative-friendly social media platform. This coming from my good friends over at the Washington Examiner. Former President Donald Trump has told friends he has hundreds of millions of dollars in backing for a new social media venture that would give him an online presence and protect conservatives from being shut down online. Two sources familiar with the discussion said investors included Silicon Valley figures motivated by fears of censorship and online cancel culture. Details emerged as Trump began a new phase of his post-presidency, giving television interviews from his Florida base in the week after his Senate impeachment acquittal, On Wednesday, he boasted about the millions of people who followed him on his now shuttered Twitter and Facebook accounts, and confirmed that he had considered buying a social media company. We are negotiating with a number of people, he told Newsmax TV. There is also the option of building your own site because we have more people than anybody, so you can literally build your own site. But we were being really harassed on Twitter. They were putting up all sorts of flags, I guess they could call them. They were flagging almost anything you said. Trump was banned from several social media platforms in the aftermath of the attack on the Capitol by some of his supporters. Twitter, of which Trump was a prolific user, said the president's tweets posed the risk of further violence. At the time, Trump said we have been negotiating with various other sites and we'll have a big announcement soon. Well, we also look into the possibilities of building out our own platform in the near future. Since leaving office, he has split his time between his home at the Mar-a-Lago Club in Palm Beach and his nearby golf course, while gradually building a new political operation. Visitors have included House Republican leader Senator McCarthy, as well as his second-in-command, Representative Steve Scalise, according to reports. His new website and an email mailing list were put together by Nucleus, a digital campaign firm run by Brad Pascal, who was Trump's 2020 campaign manager, until he was replaced in July last year. Two sources familiar with the discussion said Trump had also met with potential investors in a new online venture designed to allow the former president to engage with his supporters and protect them from being taken offline. Trump's team is using the free speech argument to attract libertarian donors, said one Republican. They are the people you might expect, he said. Now, with impeachment out of the way on Saturday, this week triggered a new phase in Trump's life after the White House. On Tuesday, he launched a blistering attack on his one-time loyal Senate Lieutenant, Senator Mitch McConnell, calling him a political hack and threatening to back primary candidates. A day later, he dialed into 3 television interviews to pay tribute to conservative talk show host Rush Limbaugh, who died on Wednesday, as well as to reheat his unfounded claims that the election was stolen from him. Chairman of the American Conservative Union, Matt Schlapp, said it was impossible for Twitter, Facebook, and other tech giants to keep Trump out of politics. His TV appearances marked a welcome return for the 74 million people who voted for him in November, he said. There is a real despondent feeling among those people, he said, and many were buoyed to hear the former president. We never had a president get silenced before. It's never happened. A spokesman for Trump did not respond to a request for comment. In the meantime, many of his supporters have migrated to messaging sites such as Telegram, or other microblogging sites such as Parler, which has itself been taken offline last month by its host Amazon Web Services over a pattern of hateful posts. It later emerged that Trump had been in talks with the Trump Organization last year, offering a 40% stake if he made the no-holds-barred platform his online home, according to BuzzFeed News. Gab, a social media platform popular with Trump supporters, is even keeping a seat, or at least a handle one for the former president. At Real Donald Trump is and always has been a mere archive of POTUS's tweets and statements that we've run for years. Wrote Chief Executive Andrew Torba in a recent post on the platform. We've always been transparent about this and would obviously let people know if the president started using it. And, I mean, this almost kind of reminds me a lot of, as I had read in the premise, this is a little bit of a teaser here. It says that in the 1990s, we had CompuServe and Apple, or CompuServe and Prodigy owning everything on their platforms, but they could kick people off their networks for any reason. Nowadays, the web was different. In these days, the web was different. No one owned it, owned the information on it, or could kick anyone off. That was the idea, at least before the web was captured by a handful of corporations. So something to look into with that in-premise thing. And not only are Republicans and Trump supporters being fed up with big tech, but as it always seems, they're fed up with most major big media outlets, including Fox News. And in fact, we got this from theblaze.com. It says Trump supporters embrace Newsmax and OANN, while confidence in Fox News as the most trusted source of news plummets in a poll. Fox News received more bad news on Sunday after a poll found that a large percentage of Trump supporters no longer embrace the cable news behemoth as a more trusted source of news. A new USA Today Suffolk poll said that only 34% of Trump voters named Fox News as their most trusted source of news. This is a massive 24% drop from the poll in October 2016, when 58% of former President Donald Trump supporters declared Fox News as their most trusted news source. Trump voters are jumping the Fox News ship and embracing relative newcomers Newsmax and One American News Network. The poll of 1,000 Trump supporters taken by phone between February 15th and 19th found that 17% of Trump voters see Newsmax as their most trusted source of news, and 9% trust OANN. At the time of our October 2016 poll, OANN and Newsmax were barely 2 years old, so they were not offered as options, said David Paleologos, director of the Suffolk University Political Research Center. However, we do not believe that in 2016 they would have been trusted the most by a statistically significant portion of respondents. Newsmax and OANN are snatching Trump's most loyal backers. The survey found that 92% of Newsmax viewers believe Joe Biden was illegitimately elected, tuning to Newsmax, and 90% of OANN watchers view the legitimacy of the 2020 presidential election. If they had to choose between the Republican Party and Donald Trump, those who trust Fox News skew 51 to 37 in favor of the former president. But with those committed to Newsmax, 72% chose Trump over the GOP, and the percentage jumps to 80% in Trump's corner for viewers who watch OANN. In a Hill-Harris X poll from earlier this month, 64% of Republicans said that they would quit the GOP to follow Trump if he started a third party. Paleologos said the switch from longtime cable news powerhouse Fox News to these burgeoning alternatives is a seismic shift in the landscape of trusted news sources for conservatives. He added that despite the falling numbers, Fox News is still the most trusted news network/media source among previously identified Trump voters. This continues a worrying trend for Fox News, which has seen its TV ratings drop ever since the 2020 presidential election. Fox News lost the primetime ratings war to CNN in the week after election night. In the 2 weeks after the 2020 election, Fox News saw a drop of 32% in viewership among the coveted 25 to 54 age demographic during primetime. During the week of the riots at the U.S. Capitol building in early January, perennial ratings champion Fox News fell to third place behind CNN and MSNBC. So we see there that even among news outlets, most Republicans and Trump supporters are going to alternative outlets. So, the era of big media, the era of big tech, big social media, it's basically dead. Leave a comment below if you think that's true. Also leave a comment if you are on other social media platforms, and click the link in the description for my contact information, and I'll see you in the next video. Two big things are happening on Capitol Hill today. The first one is the hearing on what happened on January 6th. And this coming from apnews.com. Capitol defenders cite missing intelligence for deadly breach. Misintelligence was to blame for the outmanned Capitol defenders' failure to anticipate the violent mob that invaded the iconic building and halted certification of the presidential election on January 6. The officials who were in charge of the security that day said Tuesday in their first public testimony on the insurrection. The officials, including the former chief of the Capitol Police, pointed their fingers at various federal agencies and each other for their failure to defend the building as supporters of then-President Donald Trump overwhelmed security barriers, broke windows and doors, and sent lawmakers fleeing from the House and Senate chambers. 5 people died as a result of the riot, including a Capitol police officer and a woman who was shot as she tried to enter the House chamber with lawmakers still inside. Former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund, who resigned under pressure immediately after the attack, and the other officials said they had expected the protests to be similar to two pro-Trump events in late 2020 that were far less violent. Sund said he hadn't seen an FBI field office report that warned of potential violence, citing online protests about a war. Sund described a scene as the mob arrived at the perimeter that was like nothing he had seen in his 30 years of policing, and argued that the insurrection was not the result of poor planning by Capitol Police, but of failures across the board. No single civilian law enforcement agency, and certainly not the USCP, is trained and equipped to repel, without significant military or other law enforcement assistance, an insurrection of thousands of armed, violent, and coordinated individuals focused on breaching a building at all costs, he testified. The hearing was the first of many examinations of what happened that day, coming almost 7 weeks after the attack and over a week after the Senate voted to acquit Trump of inciting the insurrection by telling his supporters to fight like hell to overturn his election defeat. Fencing and National Guard troops still surround the Capitol at a wide perimeter, cutting off streets and sidewalks that are normally full of cars, pedestrians, and tourists. The joint hearing, part of an investigation by 2 Senate committees, was the first time the officials testified publicly about the events of January 6. In addition to Sund, former Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael Stenger, former House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul Irving, and Robert Conti, the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department, testified. Irving and Stenger also resigned under pressure immediately after the deadly attack. They were Sund supervisors and in charge of security for the House and Senate. We have the facts and the answers are in this room, Senate Rules Committee Chairwoman Amy Klobuchar said at the beginning of the hearing. The Rules panel is conducting the joint probe with the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. Even after the hearing, much still remains about what happened before and during the assault. How much did law enforcement agencies know about plans for violence that day, many of which were public? And how could the Capitol Police have been so well prepared for a violent insurrection that was organized online? Sund told the lawmakers that he didn't know that his officers had received a report from the FBI's field office in Norfolk, Virginia, that forecast in detail the chances that extremists could bring war to Washington the following day. The head of the FBI's office in Washington has said that once he received the January 5th warning, the information was quickly shared with other law enforcement agencies through a joint terrorism task force. Sund said Tuesday that an officer on the task force had received a memo and forwarded it to a sergeant working on intelligence for the Capitol Police, but that the information was not sent on to other supervisors. How could he not get that vital intelligence? As Senate Homeland Chairman Gary Peters, Democrat in Michigan, who said the failure of the report to reach the chief was clearly a major problem. The information would have been helpful, Sund acknowledged. Even without the intelligence, there were clear signs that violence was a possibility on January 6. Far-right social media users openly hinted for weeks that chaos would erupt at the U.S. Capitol while Congress convened to certify the election results. Sund said that he did see an intelligence report created within his own department warning that Congress could be targeted on January 6, but he said that report assessed the probability of civil disobedience or arrest based on the information they had as remote, too improbable for the groups expected to demonstrate. Hold on 1 minute. Conti, the acting city police chief, also suggested that no one had flagged the FBI information from Norfolk, Virginia, which he said came in the form of an email. He said he would have expected that kind of intelligence would warn a police call or something. Senator Irving disagreed on whether the National Guard was called and on request for the Guard beforehand. Sun said he spoke to both Stenger and Irving about requesting the National Guard in the days before the riot, and that Irving said he was concerned about the optics of having them present. Irving denied that, saying Sun's account was categorically false. We all agreed the intelligence did not support the troops and collectively decided to let it go, Stenger said. After smashing through the barriers at the perimeter, the invaders engaged in hand-to-hand combat with police officers, injuring dozens of them, and broke into the building. Now, once the violence had begun, Sun and Irving also disagreed on when the National Guard was requested. Sun said he requested it at 1:09 p.m., but Irving denied receiving a call at that time. Conti said he was stunned over the delayed response. He said Sun was pleading with MER officials to deploy National Guard troops as the rioting rapidly escalated. Police officers were out there literally fighting for their lives, but the officials appeared to be going through a check-the-boxes exercise, she said. Pentagon officials, who will be invited to testify before the committee at a second hearing next week, have said it took time to put the troops in position and that there was not nearly enough contingency planning in advance. They said that they offered the assistance beforehand, but were turned down. Klobuchar said after the hearing that the next police chief should have greater ability to make decisions, both leading up to and during a crisis, and the rules panel could consider such legislation once the investigation is completed. The current structure clearly needs some reform, she said. The hearing Tuesday was the first of several this week, examining what went wrong January 6th. A House subcommittee will examine damage to the Capitol on Wednesday and will hear testimony from current security officers, including Acting Capitol Police Chief Yogananda Pittman on Thursday. Next week, the Senate panels will invite officials from the Pentagon, FBI, and Homeland Security Department and prepare testimony released ahead of the hearing on damage to the Capitol. Architect of the Capitol, Jay Blanton, and the curator of the House of Representatives, Barbara Elliott, described damage to the statues and paintings and quick thinking by staff as the rioting was underway, including one aide who secured the House's 1819 silver inkstand, the oldest object in the chamber. Congress is also considering a bipartisan investigation, independent commission, and multiple congressional committees have said they will look at different aspects of the siege. Federal law enforcement has arrested more than 230 people who were attacked or who were accused of being involved in the attack. And Attorney General nominee Merrick Garland said in his confirmation hearing Monday that investigating the riot would be a priority. Now, I look forward to each of those hearings, and it'll be interesting to see just what will happen because of all that. But there is something else at stake, according to the Washington Post. And at stake in the Senate hearing Tuesday, the story of the Capitol riot and who is responsible. The public inquest into the deadly January 6th riot at the Capitol begins a new phase Tuesday when 4 law enforcement officials, 3 of whom resigned their posts and some of whom have never before spoken publicly about the attack, face lawmakers aiming to uncover what led to the violence and prevent future unrest. But Tuesday's hearing before members of 2 Senate committees could also become a battleground for competing narratives over what prompted the riot and who is responsible for it, a question that became even more poignant following former President Donald Trump's acquittal on an impeachment charge earlier this month. Trump's allies in Congress and beyond have sought to downplay Trump's role in gathering his supporters in Washington and spreading the false claim that he, not President Biden, won the November election, facts that led to bipartisan impeachment proceedings. Instead, they have sought to blame lapses by Capitol security officials, and the congressional leaders that they report to for the building's invasion. That has heightened the drama surrounding the expected testimony of former House Sergeant-at-Arms Paul D. Irving and former Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Michael C. Stenger, who resigned quickly after the riot was suppressed. Now the men have spoken publicly about their experiences and decision-making before and during the riot. Also expected to appear Tuesday former Capitol Police Chief Stephen A. Sund, who has spoken to media outlets about the frustrations, requesting assistance from Irving and Stenger ahead of the riot, and acting DC Police Chief Robert J. Conte III, whose officers engaged in some of the most brutal clashes with rioters at the Capitol's doors. The riot resulted in the deaths of one Capitol Police officer and 4 others. Democrat Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, chair of the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, said in an interview that reparations for the hearing had been strictly bipartisan and that she expected a constructive tone to prevail. This is a moment to get the actual facts about what happened at the Capitol, she said. The issues we identify and the answers we get are part of the solution. So this isn't just about throwing popcorn at a movie screen trying to get sound bites. We actually have to make decisions in the coming months. But she acknowledged that other senators may focus on contested aspects of the narrative surrounding the attack. Those questions are likely to include what role Democrat House Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California and Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell of Kentucky played in reviewing or approving plans for Capitol security ahead of the attack. Irving reported to Pelosi and Stenger reported to McConnell, who was majority leader at the time of the riot. Both men sit on the Capitol Police Board, a secretive 4-member body overseeing congressional security matters that also includes the chief of the Capitol Police and the presidentially appointed architect of the Capitol. Now, while neither Irving nor Stenger has addressed the matter publicly, a former Capitol security official who spoke to the Washington Post last month at Irving's request relayed that Irving dismissed Sund's request to place National Guard troops on call, citing the optics of stationing uniformed military personnel at the seat of the federal government. Irving did not consult with Pelosi on the decision to reject the request, said the official. Former Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Bill Pickle, but Irving believed he was reflecting her wishes. Now, that has not stopped several high-ranking House Republicans from seeking to add Pelosi to the list of those responsible for the events of January 6. The top GOP members of 4 House committees last week demanded Pelosi answer questions about her knowledge of the security preparations, contending that many important questions about your responsibility for the security of the Capitol remain unanswered. The Speaker is responsible for all operational decisions made within the House, they wrote. Other GOP allies are also joining in, including conservative watchdog group Judicial Watch, which has gone to court with its demand for emails among members of the Capitol security apparatus, as well as a blanket demand for security video at the Capitol. We don't trust Nancy Pelosi, or frankly any other politician, to honestly examine the many controversies surrounding January 6th, and so we want a closer look, the group said in an email last week. Pelosi spokesman Drew Hamill said the GOP letter reflected an attempt to deflect responsibility for the Capitol attack from Donald Trump, and noted that Irving and Sund briefed House lawmakers the day before the riot and assured them that all necessary precautions have been made or have been taken. As a target of an assassination attempt, the Speaker knows all too well the importance of security at the Capitol and is focused on getting to the bottom of all issues facing the Capitol complex and the events that led up to the insurrection, Hamill said. Republican senators have not made a similar demand for transparency from McConnell, who oversaw Stenger's hiring in 2018 and requested his resignation in the immediate aftermath of the riot. But one senator who will ask questions Tuesday has shown a willingness to challenge the prevailing evidence showing that the Capitol attack was conducted by Trump supporters, at least some of whom saw the infiltration of the Capitol as a way to obstruct the counting of electoral votes that was underway at the time and prevent Biden's inauguration. Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin has publicly suggested that Pelosi is to blame for the riot, and last week questioned whether the events of January 6 could be fairly considered an armed insurrection, despite the fact that civil rioters were carrying weapons and a cache of weapons was found near the Capitol grounds. A spokesman for Johnson did not return a request for comment Monday. Three of the Republican senators who will participate in Tuesday's questioning, Josh Hawley of Missouri, Ted Cruz of Texas, and Cindy Hyde-Smith of Mississippi, voted to discount at least one state's electoral votes after the riot took place. Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee Democrat Chairman Gary Peters of Michigan said in an interview Monday that he expects Tuesday's hearings to lead to even more questions about what contributed to the security failures on January 6. Both he and Klobuchar had said that at least one additional hearing will be called featuring senior officials of the federal agencies who were involved in the preparations and response to the insurrection. We need to know more about what happened prior to January 6, and that's certainly something I will be focused on as chairman, Peters said, noting that it certainly seems there was a major failure of leadership. But he sidestepped questions about whether the expected grilling or rearing in Stenger might yield to a more partisan and acrimonious debate over whether Pelosi or their elected officials bear responsibility for the preparation for the lack of preparedness. Klobuchar and Peters stressed that they are working in close coordination with the top Republicans on their panel, Roy Blunt of Missouri and Rob Portman of Ohio, and expect to continue the investigation on a nonpartisan basis. We need to know, was there credible intelligence about potential violence? When was it known and who knew it? Portman is expected to say. According to a copy of his prepared statement obtained by the Post, we need to know what happened and how to ensure that this never happens again. Peters would not speculate about what the final product of the panel's investigations would be, except to say that after a number of hearings, there were likely to be a series of policy decisions. Klobuchar said the hearing may result in improvements on the gathering and intelligence and analysis of intelligence on threats to the Capitol, as well as the possible restructuring of the Capitol Police Board. In addition to the congressional probe, federal prosecutors are continuing to file cases against rioters. The Government Agent Accountability Office is probing security preparations, and top congressional leaders continue to discuss creating an outside commission to investigate the attack, one modeled on that partisan 9/11 commission. That effort, however, appeared to be on hold Monday amid a partisan dispute about its structure. Now, if that commission does take place, it'll be definitely worth watching. I had seen some of the 9/11 Commission hearings, and they were real eye-opening. As a matter of fact, I had the 9/11 Commission report, and thumbing through it, I found it to be rather eye-opening and rather interesting at how many of the intelligence and criminal law enforcement agencies were at odds and not sharing intelligence or information with each other, and that's what I think happened on January 6th. But there is some other news here. We also have Merrick Garland having a hearing for Attorney General. This coming from my good friends at the Daily Signal. Now this is a rather long article. Link will be in the description, so I'll just highlight the first few, the first paragraph of some of the highlights. There are 7 takeaways as Merrick Garland gets a hearing for Attorney General. Merrick Garland, whose nomination 5 years ago to the Supreme Court was doomed, finally got a hearing Monday before the Senate Judiciary Committee as President Joe Biden's nominee for Attorney General. Judging from their statements, the panel's Republican senators seem likely to confirm Garland after President Barack Obama nominated Garland for the Supreme Court in March 2016. The Republican-controlled Senate denied him a judiciary vote or a judiciary confirmation hearing and votes, saying that the election was 8 months away and that the new president should make the choice. Now, although Garland didn't answer all questions directly Monday as Biden's nominee for Attorney General, Americans got a glimpse about how he might have ruled on the High Court regarding the Second Amendment and the death penalty. Garland, currently a federal judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, also answered questions about the new president's son, Hunter Biden, calls to defund police agencies, and the Capitol Riot. Here are 7 major highlights from his confirmation hearing. Number 1, Durham's probe and Hunter Biden. During William Barr's confirmation hearing as President and Donald Trump's third Attorney General, he pledged not to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller, who was leading an investigation of Russian meddling into the 2016 presidential campaign and allegations that Trump colluded with Moscow. Numerous Republican senators asked Garland whether he would make the same commitment not to terminate Special Counsel John Durham, who is investigating the Obama Justice Department and origins of the FBI's Russia probe. Durham's investigation so far has led to the conviction of an FBI lawyer for lying on a surveillance application to a national security court. Garland wouldn't be definitive, only repeating that he had no reason to believe Durham wouldn't be able to complete the investigation. When asked if he would release a report by Durham to Congress, as Barr released Mueller's final report, Garland again was non-committal. "I'm a great believer in transparency," Garland said. "I will, though, have to talk with Mr. Durham and understand the nature of what he's been doing and the nature of the report." And U.S. Attorney for Delaware David Weiss is conducting the investigation of Hunter Biden. Weiss and Durham are the only lead prosecutors who Biden didn't fire after taking office, as is the practice for new presidents. Number 2, Oklahoma bombing and Capitol Riot. As a federal prosecutor himself, Garland famously gained a conviction of Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. In opening remarks Monday, he drew a parallel with the January 6th attack on the Capitol by pro-Trump rioters. From 1995 to 1997, I supervised the prosecution of the perpetrators of the bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building, who sought to spark a revolution that would topple the federal government, Garland said. If confirmed, I will supervise the prosecution of white supremacists and others who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, a heinous attack that sought to disrupt the cornerstone of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power to a newly elected government. And Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, Democrat of Rhode Island, asked about looking upstream from Capitol rioters and investigating who organized and funded the riot. "We will pursue these leads wherever they take us. That's the job of a prosecution," Garland said. Number 3, room under law to pursue gun control. Garland said that the Biden administration likely would pursue gun control to the extent that the Supreme Court rulings allow. The president is a strong supporter of gun control and has been an advocate all his professional life on this question, Garland said. The role of the Justice Department is to advance the policy program of the administration. As long as it is consistent with the law, the High Court allows for this, he argued. So far, we have little inclination from the Supreme Court as to what this means, but we don't have a complete indication, Garland said. Where there is room under the law for the president's policies to be pursued, I think the president should pursue them. And number 4, he is against defunding the police, but Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri asked Garland about the movement by activists on the left and some in Congress to defund police agencies on the federal, state, and local levels. I have to tell you that I think this sends the wrong message to law enforcement, who feel very much overburdened, underpaid, and under siege, Hawley said. Garland said he doesn't support the idea of defunding police. President Biden has said he does not support defunding the police, and neither do I, Garland told Hawley. We saw how difficult the lives of police officers were in the body cam videos we saw when they were defending the Capitol. Now, Biden's position on defunding police was somewhat ambiguous during the presidential campaign, and Garland said that I do believe, and I believe President Biden believes as well, that we do need to put resources into alternative ways of confronting some actors, particularly those who are mentally ill and those who are suicidal, so that police officers don't have to do a job that they are not trained for, and from what I understand, they don't want to do. Number 5, great pause on death penalty. Democrat Senator particularly of Vermont Merrick Garland would favor a moratorium on the death penalty, while Leahy and colleagues worked on legislation to eliminate the death penalty. Garland secured the death penalty on the McVeigh case in Oklahoma City. McVeigh, who blew up a federal building in 1995, killing more than 100, was convicted in 1997. He was executed in 2001. Garland talked about the 2-decade pause in federal executions. In 2020, the Trump administration's Justice Department lifted a moratorium and allowed the execution of 6 federal inmates on death row, all convicted well before Trump took office. As you know, Senator President Biden is an opponent of the death penalty. Garland told Leahy, I have to say that over those almost 20 years, the federal death penalty had been paused. I have had great pause about the death penalty. And number 6, transports is a difficult societal question. Republican Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana asked Garland about biological males competing on female sports teams in high school, a question he sought to avoid answering. Kennedy read a statement saying, allowing biological males to compete in an all-female sport deprives women of the opportunity to participate fully and fairly in sports and is fundamentally unfair to female athletes. This is a very difficult societal question you're asking right now, Garland responded, to which Kennedy retorted, I know, but you're going to be Attorney General. Garland said that the issue of transgender athletes is not something he has had the chance to review carefully as a legal matter. I may not be the one who has to make policy decisions like that. It's not that I am averse to it, Garland said. Look, I think every human being should be treated with dignity and respect. Number 7, shameful family separation. Durbin, the committee's chairman, raised a zero-tolerance policy of the Justice Department that led to separating children from adults when illegal immigrant families were caught at the southern border. Thousands of children were forcibly removed from their parents, separated, and many times lost in the bureaucracy, Durbin said, adding, this committee is going to hold oversight hearings and see get to the bottom of this. Will you commit to cooperating with those investigations? Garland pledged cooperation. I think that oversight responsibility of this committee is one of its very most important things, Garland said. It's a duty posed by the Constitution, and I greatly respect it. I think the policy is shameful. I can't imagine anything worse than tearing parents from their children, and we will provide all the cooperation we possibly can. Now, Garland was a little iffy on a few things. As a matter of fact, I'll get into that with the article from the Washington Times coming up in a few minutes. Well, let's get to that right now, because it is important. AG nominee Garland says he doesn't support defunding police. Attorney General nominee Judge Merrick Garland said Monday he doesn't support defunding the police. President Biden has said he doesn't support defunding the police, and neither do I. He said during his confirmation hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee, we saw how difficult the lives of police officers were in the body cam videos we saw when they were defending the Capitol. Judge Garland continued referencing the January 6th riot at the U.S. Capitol. Several high-profile deaths of unarmed black men and women at the hands of local police last year ignited protests against brutality and calls for abolishing or defunding police departments. Some Democrats have pushed for reviews of local police budgets, demanding the diversion of funds to social and mental health services. At a town hall last week, Mr. Biden said he would put more money into local policing. Judge Garland voiced support for that decision, but also said that police are not trained to handle certain mental health calls, including those of suicidal individuals. I do believe, and I believe Mr. Biden does as well, that we do need to put resources into alternative ways of confronting some actors, particularly those who are mentally ill and those who are suicidal, so that police officers aren't doing jobs that they're not trained for, and from what I understand, don't want to do, he said, So those resources need to go to mental health professionals and others in the community so the police can do the job that they are trained for, Judge Garland continued. Now, that in and of itself is a little bit on the iffy side, so I'll definitely keep a close eye on the other hearings that Garland will have, and see just what'll come about it. Leave a comment below what you think about Merrick Garland's nomination for Attorney General, what you thought of his confirmation hearing. Also, let me know what you thought about the hearings on the January 6th riot, and I'll see you in the next video. Yesterday was the first day of congressional hearings on the January 6th Capitol Riot, and there were a lot of takeaways and also what we know and still don't know from there. All that coming today, but first we have the takeaways from the Associated Press.com. Takeaways from Congress's first hearing on Capitol Riot. Security officials testifying at Congress's first hearing on the deadly siege of the Capitol cast blame and pointed fingers on Tuesday, but also acknowledged that they were woefully unprepared for the violence. Senators drilled down on the stunning security failure and missed warning signs as rioters, former President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol on January 6 in a misguided attempt to stop lawmakers from certifying President Joe Biden's election. 5 people died in the attack, including a Capitol police officer. The security officials lost their jobs, and Trump was impeached by the House on charge of inciting the insurrection, the deadliest attack on Congress in 200 years. Trump was ultimately acquitted by the Senate. Here are some takeaways from the testimony. Failure to communicate. Intelligence warnings of an armed uprising by extremist groups heading into the Capitol didn't raise to the level of alarm or even get passed up the chain of command in time for the January 6th attack. Crucially, a key warning flare from the FBI field office in Norfolk, Virginia, of a war on the Capitol was sent the night before to the Capitol Police's Intelligence Division. But then Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sun said that he only learned about it the day before Tuesday's hearing. Instead, Sun said he was bracing for demonstrations on par with other armed protests by mobs of Trump supporters in the nation's capital in November and December following the presidential election. No entity, including the FBI, provided any intelligence indicating that there would be a coordinated violent attack on the United States Capitol by thousands of well-equipped armed insurrectionists, he testified in written remarks about a conference called the day before the attack. The Democrat chair of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, Senator Gary Peters of Michigan, said there was a failure to take this threat more seriously. Number 2, he said, she said, as hundreds of rioters from the Capitol breaking into the iconic building's windows and doors, sometimes in hand-to-hand combat with police, there were conflicting accounts from security officials over what happened next. Sun, who had raised the idea of calling the National Guard for backup days earlier, specifically recounted a 1:09 p.m. phone call he made to the then Sergeant of Arms of the House, Paul Irving, his superior, requesting National Guard troops. Sun said he was told that they would run it up the chain of command. Irving said he had no recollection of the conversation at that time and instead recalls the conversation nearly 20 minutes later. He said that 1:09 p.m. call does not show up on his cell phone log. As the riot escalated, Sun was pleading with Army officials for Guard troops in another phone call. Testified Robert Conti III, the acting chief of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department, whose officers had arrived for backup. Conti said he was stunned at the delayed response from the military. Defense Department officials said that they offered National Guard troops days earlier, but were rebuffed. Pentagon officials are scheduled to testify to the Senate next week. Common facts: a planned insurrection. At the start of the hearing, coming 10 days after Trump was acquitted by the Senate on the impeachment charge of inciting the insurrection, some common facts were agreed to. Democrat Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, the chair of the Rules Committee, said that the security officials, or asked the security officials if there was any doubt that the riot was a planned attack and carried out by white nationalist and extremist groups. None of the witnesses disputed the characterization of the facts of January 6. Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin read an alternative account of mostly peaceful protesters festive that day that he encouraged colleagues to consider. But in closing, Klobuchar restated the testimony. There was clear agreement that this was a planned insurrection. One officer's personal story. The hearing opened with Capitol Police Department Carnecia Mendoza, a 19-year veteran of the force, delivering a compelling personal account of being caught at home that day as she was spending time with her 10-year-old just before the start of her shift. She rushed to the Capitol only to find the worst of the worst scene of her career. A former Army veteran, she recounted the deadly mayhem, fending off rioters in the building's stately rotunda, inhaling gas and suffering chemical burns to her face that she said still have not healed. Her Fitbit recorded 4 hours of sustained activity, she said. The next night and following day, she spent at the hospital consoling the family of Officer Brian Sicknick, who died after the attack. As an American and as an Army veteran, it is sad to see us attacked by our fellow citizens, Mendoza told the senators. Trump shadow. The former president was hardly a presence at the first hearing. Instead, senators largely set aside their should-be partisan race to drill down on the facts of what happened that day, on how to prevent it from happening again. Democrat Senator Alex Padilla of California pointedly asked for the name of the commander-in-chief of the armed forces that day, who was ultimately responsible for the military and security of the country. That brought the former president's name. Among the senators on the panels were two of Trump's staunch allies who led the effort to overturn Biden's election victory, Republican Senators Josh Hawley of Missouri and Ted Cruz of Texas. Now, interestingly enough, that the former president was hardly a presence at the first hearing, probably trying to get their facts straight. And while it is true that Trump was the commander-in-chief, there were certain other characteristics that needed explaining, and I think that's what happened on the first day. They might get into it a little more on the second and third day, but there are more highlights. This from our good friends over at the Daily Signal. Kind of a long article, so I'll just read bits and pieces of it. Six highlights from Congress's first hearing on Capitol Riot. Former and current officials responsible for securing the U.S. Capitol fielded questions Tuesday from senators about how the January 6 rioters could have reached the building. And it said 2 Senate committees held the first such oversight hearing about a mob's ability to storm the Capitol. Here are key highlights from the hearing, likely to be followed by many more on the topic. Number 1, coordinated attack. Officials said the attack on the Capitol clearly was planned in advance, and the rioters began their assault on the Capitol while Trump was addressing a rally on the Ellipse, a park south of the White House. Now, the fact that the group attacked our restaurant 20 minutes before the event at the Ellipse ended, they were planning on our agency not being at full strength at that time. Sun testified referring to Capitol Police. And Conti said that he certainly believes that it was coordinated. And number 2 was the lack of intelligence sharing. And it said that Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Chairman Gary Peters of Michigan said lawmakers were conducting a broad investigation beyond this initial hearing into what he called the colossal breakdown in security that allowed the Capitol to be reached. The FBI's Norfolk office forwarded intelligence to the Bureau's Joint Terrorism Task Force, which in turn forwarded it on the evening of January 5th to the Intelligence Division of U.S. Capitol Police. Officials and several senators referred to the possibility that the information about a security threat could have been emailed without follow-up. And it's number 3 is rejecting complicit charge. Each of the law enforcement officers who testified seemed to take offense to a quoted comments by Russell Honore, a retired Army lieutenant general who said in an MSNBC interview, I think once this all gets uncovered, it was complicit actions by Capitol Police. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, Democrat California, has appointed Honore to lead an investigation on the Capitol attack. And in response to Senator Hawley asking if he was complicit in the attack on January 6th, Sun answered first saying absolutely not, and I think it is disrespectful to myself and members of the Capitol Police Department. Irving responded absolutely not, Senator. And number 4, National Guard and Optics. Hawley also goes to the officials on why they determined that the National Guard would not be needed. You do say that Mr. Irving advised you he needed to run it, namely the request for the National Guard. Up the chain of command, Hawley said the Sun who affirmed this. And Hawley asked Irving who he was referring to in the chain of command. Irving said, I have no recollection of that call, neither do I have a record of it. Irving said he got a call from Sun at 1:30 p.m. in which the Capitol Police Chief said conditions were deteriorating, but said he didn't tell Sun that he would run a request for National Guard troops up the chain of command. The Missouri Republican later referred to Sun's statement that Irving had said that he was concerned about the optics of having the Guard deployed. Sun said on the 4th it wasn't a phone call, it was an in-person visit over to Irving's office, where I went in and requested the National Guard. Number 5, lack of training. Senator James Lankford of Oklahoma said he was puzzled about what officials called a lack of training to deal with such a situation. There wasn't training for what to do if a mass group actually comes through the door and tries to burst through, whether it's an insurrection type of event, whether it's a mob that's gone crazy, whether it's a protest just gets out of hand. To be able to burst through the door, Lankford said. He later asked, is there such a need for a much greater, less than lethal force capability on the part of officers at the time, or available to officers and clear rules of engagement if you have a group of people trying to get into the building unauthorized? Sun, the former Capitol Police Chief, responded, we do train for people trying to get into the building. We don't train for an insurrection of thousands of people. Our officers do have less than lethal capability that they do carry with them. With hindsight being what it is, I think there needs to be an additional training, additional equipment to consider for this type of attack in the future. And number 6, questions about provocateurs. Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin read aloud from and entered into the Senate record an article by J. Michael Waller, a senior analyst at the Center for Security Policy, a national security think tank. In it, Walker writes that provocateurs infiltrated a pro-Trump march with peaceful protesters and ripped up a normally law-abiding crowd to turn in against law enforcement. Walker was an eyewitness to the Trump rally January 6th before it turned into a riot. I would really recommend everyone on the committee read this account, Johnson said. During Trump's Senate impeachment trial on the charge of inciting insurrection, House Democrats asserted that the riot was foreseeable because of the 45th president's rhetoric in disputing the outcome of the presidential or of the November election. The House managers made a big deal that this was predictable, this was foreseeable, which I don't believe. Do you believe the breach of the Capitol, or do you believe that that was foreseeable and predictable? Johnson asked the former Capitol Police Chief. Sun said neither he nor leaders of other federal agencies were aware of such a threat, and referred to the DC Police Chief's earlier comment. The breach of the Capitol was not something anybody anticipated, Sun said, nor do I think some of our federal partners expected. I don't think the Secret Service would have brought up the Vice President if they expected it. Johnson then pressed on what police expected from Trump supporters, which gained a less clear response from the former Capitol Police Chief. Is part of that because of what you had experienced in the past, with what Mr. Waller experienced, that the vast majority of Trump supporters are pro-law enforcement, and the last thing they would want to do is violate the law? Sun responded, I will say that that information I received from some of my officers was that they were trying to prevent people from coming into the building, and people were showing up saying, we're police, let us through, and still wanted to violate the law to get inside the building. So that's rather interesting. I know I skimmed through some of it, but the The link to this article, as well as all the articles that I'm reading today, are in the description below. So read it and take from it what you will. Now, and there's still stuff, and like I said earlier, there's still what we know and still don't. As Congress starts this investigation, this from Politico.com. Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, there was an image. Congress is taking its first steps toward a potentially massive investigation into the failures that contributed to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th. But its initial foray only underscored how little lawmakers and the public know about what truly happened that day. 5 hours of Senate testimony on Tuesday from top security officials only added to the mounting questions about an attack by supporters of former President Donald Trump that threatened an entire branch of government. Here's what we've learned so far, and most importantly, what investigators left for another day. Pentagon and Homeland Security officials need their turn. Senate leaders from both parties always intended for the inquiry to press on with additional hearings, and they came away with obvious investigative leads on Tuesday. Almost immediately after the joint session oversight hearing began, senators were calling for testimony from senior officials at the Pentagon, FBI, and Department of Homeland Security, some of whom were directly implicated by the 4 witnesses: former Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund, former House Sergeant at Arms Paul Irving, former Senate Sergeant at Arms Michael Stenger, and acting DC Police Chief Robert Conti. Even though that group largely passed the buck to other federal agencies and departments, the current and former officials gave lawmakers new lines of inquiry to pursue. In particular, the witnesses described intelligence breakdowns as well as bureaucratic delays from the Defense Department that left them unprepared to defend the Capitol from the violent mob. Sund and Conti described a conference call during which top Pentagon officials said they worried about the optics of sending armed troops to the Capitol, even as the police chiefs said their respective forces were desperate for backup. And Pentagon and Homeland Security officials will get their time soon. Those revelations prompted the Democrat chairs of the 2 committees spearheading the probe, Gary Peters of Michigan and Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, to immediately seek testimony from the officials in question. Though they declined to name specific individuals, Peters and Klobuchar said they plan to convene another hearing next week, and that it would feature Pentagon, Homeland Security, and FBI officials. There were clearly mistakes made on many sides, but it's also on their front what happened with the National Guard, said Klobuchar, who chairs the Rules Committee, and while they should have been set up ahead of time, that is true given some of the intelligence out by January 3rd. By that day, was there a delay? Republican Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, the top Republican on the Rules Committee, went so far as to posit that the Capitol Police's entire structure is almost totally unworkable in times of crisis, and that the logistical hurdles actually got in the way of coordinating with federal entities outside of the Capitol. Still, Blunt said he wants to question the FBI next week about possible intelligence failures from adequately, that prevented Capitol security officials from adequately preparing for the events of January 6th. One big discrepancy and multiple mysteries remain. Senators largely failed to procure new information out of their witnesses beyond what they divulged in lengthy and at times contradictory opening statements. The most glaring discrepancy that Sund claimed he spoke to Irving at 1:09 p.m. on January 6th and requested National Guard help, while Irving insisted he was on the House floor at the time and received no call from Sund or anyone else. Irving appears to be at least partially correct. C-SPAN video shows he was on the floor at the precise moment the clock struck 1:09 p.m., but senators never raised that fact, and they were often so rushed to squeeze in multiple streams of questions that they left the essential information unaddressed. Remarkably, the cause of Brian Sicknick's death has remained a mystery, even as it's become a symbol of the intense violence of the Trump-inspired riot over the past 48 days. And lawmakers passed on a chance to nudge more details out of the notorious secretive Capitol Police. March 4th viewers gave short shrift. Senator Jackie Rosen, Democrat of Nevada, concluded her questioning with a request for information about potential violence on March 4th the Constitution's original inauguration day, which authorities have warned could feature another attempted attack by those who refuse to accept the election results, which she asked was being done by authorities in Washington to prepare. But as law enforcement officials started to respond, Rosen's time expired. Klobuchar ushered the hearing to the next scheduled Senator Merrick Garland, leaving Rosen's question unanswered. Johnson's alone in his theory. Republican Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin used part of his time during Tuesday's hearing to read a discredited conspiracy theory into the record, quoting generously from a conservative commentary piece that attributed the January 6th insurrection to over-aggressive police and a band of provocateurs posing as Trump supporters. Johnson showed that he's on an island among his Senate colleagues for pushing that notion. All four witnesses were clear that they considered the January 6th event to be an insurrection aided by white supremacists. Honore is about to face friction. Republicans have been sharply critical in recent days of retired Lieutenant General Russell Honore. Speaker Nancy Pelosi's pick to conduct an interim review of Capitol security following the insurrection. Past recent commentary from Honore shows he was harshly critical of Sund, the sergeant at arms, and of the police officers themselves, calling them complicit in violence by the virtue of their actions. Under questioning from Hawley and later from Republican Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, the witnesses repudiated Honore's comments. Sund called Honore's comments highly disrespectful to the hardworking men and women of the Capitol Police. This exchange underscores that Honore is likely to take further political heat as he prepares to render judgment about future plans for Capitol security. And Trump's a non-entity. So far, one name that didn't come up much during the hearing, Trump. So the House impeached Trump for inciting the insurrection, a move followed by acquittal in the Senate trial. The impeachment itself was only sparingly mentioned and his role minimally discussed. Trump came up when Sund emphasized that only the ex-president, who controlled DC's National Guard forces, had the ultimate authority to deploy those troops when the Capitol was in danger, but there was little effort to probe the former president's actions, and no witnesses indicated that they had any knowledge of whether the president himself was weighing in on security issues that they pleaded for assistance. Now, I mean, all that, and I'm interested in seeing just what will happen next week. But there's this from Town Hall, pretty much says just about the same thing, but give you brief highlights of it. There's a Marquee hearing on January 6th. Capitol attack shows security disarray. Tuesday's high-profile public hearing to examine the January 6th attack on the Capitol exposed inconsistencies from former security officials on what occurred, a fragmented Capitol Police Board, and unwillingness to call a failure a failure. And it says, contrary to what others have said, the United States Capitol Police did not fail. Stevenson told the joint hearing of the Senate Rules and Administration and Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committees. The mission of the Capitol Police is to protect the Congress. Sund, in his written testimony, used the word successful to describe the department on January 6th. Although we were successful in accomplishing our mission on January 6, 2021, and no members were injured, and the legislative process was able to continue just a few hours later, Congress and the USCP must nevertheless look at this event and identify areas for improvement and systems that broke down or failed. Sund noted that the FBI report was raw intelligence and was not aligned with other intelligence he was privy to. Ryan Sicknick, a former Capitol Police officer, died from injuries he suffered defending the Capitol from the pro-Trump mob. In addition, 125 Capitol Police officers were physically assaulted, and more than 70 other Capitol Police officers were injured in the violent attack. All three of the former Capitol officials testifying and several senators acknowledged that there was a need to review the way in which the Capitol Police Board, which governs the department, is set up. The Capitol Police Board is made up of the architect of the Capitol and the two sergeants at arms. The current architect of the Capitol, Brett Blanton, was not part of Tuesday's hearing. And it said that, and Irving said that from his recollection, he did not receive a request for approval from National Guard until shortly after 2 p.m. And some said of everything, I'm not going to, guess why he doesn't remember. And Klobuchar said that the image of the chief trying to reach the two sergeants at arms who were trying to protect the members is not one you want to repeat again. So the chief, there has to be some new chief, some greater ability to make, or there has to be for the new chief, some greater ability to make decisions leading into a crisis, and then during crisis with some management for some kind of police accountability board. Senator John Ossoff, Democrat of Georgia, also said the structure of the board needs change, evidenced by the disagreements surrounding the call between Sun and Irving. And Klobuchar emphasized that changes to the decision-making process for the department were critical. To have that structure where in a crisis he's trying to go to them while they're trying to protect the members. It really doesn't make any sense at all, so the structure has to be changed, Klobuchar said. Beyond structure, the department's union said wide-ranging personnel changes at the top are necessary. Gus Papathanassiou, the head of the Capitol Police Union, issued a statement criticizing the former leaders of the Capitol Police. The root cause of the USCP's failure on January 6th was the failure of leadership, he said in a statement. I think the senators saw that dysfunction on display today. And it said that one takeaway from Tuesday's hearing is that this is just the beginning of Congress's look at what led to the breakdown of security on January 6th and what comes next. Klobuchar told reporters that up next will be a hearing that will feature officials at the Defense Department to discuss coordination among department security officials and agencies. Asked if a panel will be hearing from Pentagon officials, Klobuchar replied, yes, they're coming next week. We're having another hearing. And like I said, I'm looking forward to that. Leave a comment below what you think about yesterday's hearing. Also, what you're looking forward to at the next hearing. And I'll see you in the next video. Yesterday, the House of Representatives held a hearing on the disinformation in the media. And there are some highlights from there. We have this from the Daily Signal. There are 3 highlights from the House hearing on disinformation in news media. The House subcommittee held a virtual hearing Wednesday on how to weed out what Democrats call disinformation and extremism from the media. House Energy and Commerce Chairman Frank Bulow, Democrat of New Jersey, and Democrat Representative Mike Doyle of Pennsylvania, Chairman of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee, organized the hearing. The prolonged severity of the COVID-19 pandemic and the attack on our Capitol on January 6 have driven home a frightening reality. The spread of disinformation and extremism by traditional news media presents a tangible and destabilizing threat, Bulow and Doyle said in a joint statement announcing the hearing. The hearing came only 2 days after Democrat Representative Anna Eshoo of California and Democrat Representative Jerry McInerney of California sent a letter to a dozen different cable companies, including Comcast, AT&T, and Cox Communications, questioning whether they would renew contracts with One American News Network, Newsmax, and Fox News. Are you planning to continue carrying Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN? If so, why? The California Democrats asked. Experts have noted that the wide-ranging ecosystem is much more susceptible to disinformation, lies and truths and half-truths, they wrote, quoting the book Network Propaganda by Yochai Benkler, Robert Ferris, and Hal Roberts. Some conservative leaders, such as Republican Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers of Washington, view the left's efforts to stop the spread of disinformation as a direct threat to Americans' First Amendment right to free speech. Every journalist from MSNBC to CNN to the New York Times should be concerned by the majority's actions, McMorris Rodgers said in a prepared statement at Wednesday's hearing, and anyone who values free speech and a free press should be worried. Bulow and Doyle pointed the need for fact-based reporting as a central reason for the hearing, entitled Fanning the Flames, Disinformation and Extremism in the Media. 4 witnesses testified and engaged in several hours of Q&A, including Soledad O'Brien, a CNN and NBC veteran who is anchor of Hearst Television's Matter of Fact. The others were Emily Bell, a journalism professor at Columbia University, Kristen Danielle Urquiza, co-founder of the organization Wrecked by COVID, and Jonathan Turley, a George Washington University law professor. Here are three key highlights from the hearing. Number one, don't book liars on news programs. In her opening remarks, O'Brien argues that news platforms should curb dissemination of misinformation by refusing to allow liars on TV. Do not book people to lie on your show because it elevates them and presents a lie as another side, O'Brien said. It is the job of a journalist to verify information, and every perspective does not deserve a platform, she said. It is not the role of Congress to restrict media platforms or determine who appears on news programs, O'Brien argued, but rather journalists should provide the public with facts, not merely opinions. Turley, the law professor, said he is far less confident in the media's ability to determine what is a lie. I don't think it's fair to say I am in favor of free speech and free press, as long as you're not a liar, as long as what you are saying is not untrue, Turley said. He said the question remains, who is the arbiter of truth? What is the meaning that someone is a liar and someone is being untruthful, he asked. Regarding the role of government, Turley said the First Amendment does not allow Congress to determine who is a truth teller and allowed to appear on the nightly news. Number two, open markets favor bad actors. During the hearing, lawmakers and witnesses argued their views on the need for restrictions on the media or the need for freer markets that allow more voices to be heard across America's news landscape. Digital media and the lowering of barriers has helped elevate previously marginalized and ignored voices, and it's all made public discord much more diverse, Bell, the Columbia University journalism professor, said. An open market without regulation will always favor bad actors over good. Although individual choice and free markets are part of the solution to curbing misinformation, she said, I believe that there is a policy role here which is not about infringing on the First Amendment, but which is about strengthening ways in which we can have a more vibrant, truthful news environment. But Turley argued that any government regulation of the press will not produce a less objectionable product, but instead an official product, which is exactly what the free press is designed to avoid. Instead, the role of Congress and the media should be to offer the public information transparently in order to rebuild faith in both the press and political leaders, Shirley said. Here we cherish free speech and a free independent press, McMorris Rogers said in her opening remarks. We believe in dialogue and in the battle of ideas rather than censor and silence constitutionally protected speech. The answer is more speech. That's the American way. Conflict over letters. Republicans repeatedly raised concerns about the letters to cable companies from Issue and McNerney. Today's hearing, along with the majority leaders that target right-wing cable outlets, are really a dangerous escalation in the left's crusade to silence anyone who does not agree with their ideology, McMorris Rogers says. The California Democrats' letters asked the 12 cable companies a series of questions, including how many of your subscribers tune in to Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN for each of the 4 weeks preceding the November 3rd, 2020 elections and the January 6th, 2021 attacks on the Capitol. Turley called the lawmakers' letters not just chilling, but positively glacial. Ohio Representative Bob Latta, Republican, said what disturbed him the most about the letters was that they specifically targeted 3 conservative media outlets. But Issue staunchly defended the content, pointing out that the letters ask the companies questions and do not assert that Congress should restrict the freedom of the press. We have a problem in this country, it's a large one, Issue said. It's a sticky wicket because of our Constitution, but we need to examine and be frank with each other about what is taking place in the country. Social media companies play a role in spreading misinformation, but traditional media outlets should not escape scrutiny or accountability, McNerney said of why he co-authored the letters with Issue. Now, interestingly enough, this all goes back to what Andrew Breitbart said about the new media taking over where the old media failed. And this has been going on since I believe 1950, but I'm not totally sure about that. There are various questions on that, but it's picked up more steam in from the 90s today to today, especially with the repeal of the Fairness Act, which I believe Democrats are wanting to to bring back into play, among other things. But yeah, and there's more information on there. Some of it is some of the stuff in the other articles are pretty much the same, but they may have different takes. So let's get to them. This coming from the Daily Caller: House Democrats pressure TV broadcasters to deplatform conservative networks. Two House Democrats sent letters Monday to a dozen television broadcasters suggesting that they stop airing Newsmax, Fox News, and One American News Network, a move which a Republican commissioner on the FCC called a chilling transgression aimed at deplatforming the conservative networks. Are you planning to continue carrying Fox News, OANN, and Newsmax on your platform both now and beyond the renewable date? California Representatives Anna G. Eshoo and Jerry McNerney wrote in a letter to the companies. If so, why, they asked. The letters were sent to AT&T, Verizon, Roku, Amazon, Apple, Comcast, Charter, Dish, Cox, Altice, Alphabet, and Hulu. Eshoo and McNerney asked the companies what steps they took after the 2020 presidential election to monitor, respond to, and reduce the spread of disinformation, including encouragement and or incitement of violence by channels your company disseminates to millions of Americans. The lawmakers blamed the three conservative outlets for spreading disinformation about voter fraud that led to the attack on the U.S. Capitol building on January 6. They asserted that the cable and streaming companies have done nothing in response to the misinformation aired by these outlets. But in Cairo, Trump-appointed commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission called the letter a chilling transgression against the networks aimed at stifling editorial decisions and free speech. I call on my FCC colleagues to join me in publicly denouncing this attempt to stifle political speech and an independent news judgment, Cairo said in a statement on Twitter. The Democrats are sending a message that is as clear as it is troubling. These regulated entities will pay a price if the targeted newsrooms do not conform to Democrats' preferred political narratives. And there was a tweet out put out on Tuesday or on Monday by Brendan Carr. What time does the Democrats' book-burning party start? A spokesman for Fox News said that individual members of Congress calling for news outlets to be deplatformed sets a terrible precedent. As the most watched cable news channel throughout 2020, Fox News Media has provided millions of Americans with in-depth reporting, breaking news coverage, and clear opinion, a Fox News spokesperson said in a statement to the Daily Caller News Foundation. For individual members of Congress to highlight political speech they do not like and demand cable distributors engage in viewpoint discrimination sets a terrible precedent. Eshoo and McNerney sit on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, which will hold a meeting on Wednesday entitled Fanning the Flames, Disinformation and Extremism in the Media. Some broadcasters and cable networks' increasing reliance on conspiracy theories and misleading or patently false information raises questions about their devotion to journalistic integrity, Democrats on the committee wrote of the hearing. We look forward to hearing from media experts about what is being done and what more can be done to address this growing problem moving forward. Momentum has been building since the election to deplatform various conservative media companies and conservative personalities. The most prominent example is Twitter and Facebook's banning of President Donald Trump following the Capitol riots. Three other big tech firms, Apple, Google, and Amazon, all cut access after the rise of Parler, the social media platform popular with conservatives. The companies alleged that conservatives had used Parler to spread election-related disinformation and to organize the assault on the Capitol, although Facebook was mentioned far more often in charging documents against rioters who have been arrested so far. And I mean, you know, that brings up a valid point. I mean, there is such a thing as free speech, and just blocking people from social media outlets, banning them, basically just cuts free speech off right at the kneecaps, and that's why I like getting with Breitbart, because Breitbart was key, was the linchpin, the key to exposing the tactics that the old media use and how biased they have been. So, you know, the the Democrats' playbook is run by Saul Alinsky and Rules for Radicals. I've said this many times in the past, and I'll say it again. For every Saul Alinsky, be an Andrew Breitbart. I don't know. In a world of Saul Alinsky, be an Andrew Breitbart. Just get out there and expose the hypocrisy that's found in the media. And and Andrew Breitbart covered both sides, Republican and Democrat, because there are some Republicans who have one sort of bias, and there are others who have a far bias on the right, and I mean he's out to he had a mission to basically just call both sides out, and that's what we do, and that's what we try to do. There's more on this. We have this from my good friend Mary Chastain over at Legal Insurrection. Democrats pressure TV carriers to stop providing Newsmax, Fox News, or OANN. California Democrat Representatives Anna Eshoo and Jerry McNerney sent a letter to major TV carriers implying that they help the spread of information since they provide Newsmax, Fox News, and OANN. We are concerned about the role AT&T plays in disseminating misinformation to millions on Uverse, DirecTV, and AT&T TV subscribers. And we write to you today to request additional information about what actions AT&T is taking to address these issues. They wrote in the letter to AT&T. By the way, they sent the same letter to Roku, Comcast, Verizon, Amazon, Dish Network, Cox, Hulu, and others. Eshoo and McNerney demanded the providers answer these questions by March 8th. Number one, what moral or ethical principles, including those related to journalistic integrity, violence, medical information, and public health, do you apply in deciding which channels to carry or when to take adverse actions against a channel? Number two, do you require, through contracts or otherwise, that the channels you carry abide by any content guidelines? If so, please provide a copy of the guidelines. Number three, how many of your subscribers tune in to Newsmax, Fox News, and OANN on Uverse, DirecTV, and AT&T TV for each of the 4 weeks preceding the November 3rd, 2020 elections and the January 6th, 2021 attacks on the Capitol? Please specify the number of subscribers that tune in on each channel. Number four, what steps did you take prior to, on, and following the November 6th or the November 3, 2020 elections and the January 6, 2021 attacks to monitor, respond to, and reduce the spread of disinformation, including encouragement or incitement of violence by channels your company disseminates to millions of Americans? Please describe each step that you took and when it was taken. Number five, have you taken any adverse actions against the channel, including Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN, for using your platform to disseminate information or disseminate disinformation related directly or indirectly to the November 3rd, 2020 elections, the January 6, 2021 Capitol insurrection, or COVID-19 misinformation? If so, please describe each action and when it was taken and the parties involved. Number six, have you ever taken any actions against the channel for using the platform to disseminate any disinformation? If yes, please describe each action and when it was taken. Number eight, are you planning to continue carrying Fox News, Newsmax, and OANN on Uverse, DirecTV, and AT&T TV, both now and beyond any contract renewal date? If so, why? Newsmax responded, the House Democrats' attack on free speech and basic First Amendment rights should send chills on the spine of all Americans. Newsmax reported fairly and accurately on allegations and claims made by both sides during the recent election contest. We did not see that same balance when CNN and MSNBC pushed for years the Russian collusion hoax, airing numerous claims and interviews with Democrat leaders that turned out to be patently false. Yes, where were these Democrats when MSNBC and CNN did nothing but push the Russian collusion hoax for 4 years? How come they allowed failed presidential candidate Hillary Clinton to whine about President Donald Trump stealing the election from her? The Democrats complained that Newsmax called the Capitol Hill scene a sort of romantic idea. Do you know who said that? Pepperidge Farms remembers who said that and how Newsmax hosts reacted to the same. The claim was made on Newsmax by a Touro College law professor and prominent liberal Thane Rosenbaum, who was describing the rally before any violence or illegal activity taking place at the Capitol. In fact, Newsmax hosts began condemning the illegal activity that took place at the Capitol in real time, and did so repeatedly throughout the day. Fox News responded. In response to the allegations, Fox News media said in a statement, as the most watched cable news channel throughout 2020, Fox News media provided millions of Americans with in-depth reporting, breaking news coverage, and clear opinion for individual members of Congress to highlight political speech they do not like and demand cable distributors engage in viewpoint discrimination, sets a terrible precedent. The House Energy and Committee Telecom Subcommittee has a hearing on Wednesday to discuss misinformation and disinformation hosted by cable and broadcast networks. Now, they don't have any of the networks on the witness list. And I think that's odd that they don't have any, but then again, I mean, you know, they might have some later on in the future, but I personally am not going to hold my breath on it, and I hope that any other Republicans on the committee and subcommittee, you know, just take it to the panel and just ask questions that Americans really want to hear. As a matter of fact, according to the Washington Times, they actually trashed Democrats' abuse of power and pushed to silence conservative-leaning media outlets. The Democrat-led rush to sideline media outlets such as Fox and Newsmax that they accuse of disseminating disinformation ran into strong opposition Wednesday from Republicans and free speech advocates who warned that the push puts the nation on a slippery slope towards state-controlled censorship. Members of a House panel clashed over the widely held belief that among Democrats that news media outlets should pay a price for parroting from President Donald Trump's false messaging, in particular his downplaying of the coronavirus and insistence that the 2020 election was stolen. Let me put it bluntly, misinformation is killing Americans and damaging our democracy. Representative Anna G. Issue told members of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, we have to examine how conspiracies and lies convince people to dismiss public health measures and refuse life-saving vaccines. This is not about left versus right. This is about life and death, she said. Similarly, the January 6th insurrection was built on a foundation of lies about mail-in ballots, voting machines, and election results. Ms. Issue and Representative Jerry McNerney, both Democrats from California, created a stir this week by sending a letter asking major cable providers and digital streaming services to explain the safeguards they have in place to stop lies and disinformation from being circulated on their platforms. The lawmakers specifically targeted conservative-leaning news outlets. Are you planning to continue carrying Fox News, OANN, and Newsmax on your platform, both now and beyond the renewal date? They wrote, if so, why? Representative Kathy McMorris Rogers, Washington Republican, called the letter an obvious direct attack on the First Amendment. Every journalist from MSNBC and CNN to the New York Times should be concerned by the majority's actions, and anyone who values free speech and a free press should be worried, Ms. McMorris Rogers said. Election officials using their platforms to pressure companies to censor media companies they disagree with? That sounds like actions from the Chinese Communist Party, not duly elected representatives from the United States Congress. Ms. McMorris Rogers questioned whether MSNBC should be punished for sticking with their false Russian collusion narrative, and whether CNN should be targeted for the glowing accounts it gave Democrat New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's coronavirus response. Now, more than ever, we must uphold the First Amendment, she said. This is an abuse of power. In testimony before the committee, Jonathan Turley, professor at the George Washington University Law School, said, history has shown that public or private censorship does not produce better speech. It is self-replicating and self-perpetuating path that only produces more censorship and more controlled speech, said Mr. Turley. stressing that the First Amendment limits the federal government's ability to crack down on free speech. I have no illusions about the harm of disinformation and extremist speech in our society, yet I believe the speech controls pose far greater threats for our country than misguided or malevolent speech, he said. The question is, who will be the arbiter of truth in any public or private regime of speech regulation, he said. The reason that most of us have opposed state media controls is not simply because we disfavor state regulation of speech, but because we favor free speech. Rounding out the witness list were journalist Soledad O'Brien, Emily Bell, director of the Toast Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University, and Kristen Danielle Urquiza, co-founder of Make Right COVID. Ms. O'Brien said media outlets have a responsibility to stop booking liars on their program and reflect on the role they have played in feeding into the disinformation and political polarization. The panelists lamented the hollowing out of local newsrooms and shuttering of newspapers. They said the void has been filled by social media and television news, which often blur the lines between fact and opinion, leading to the spread of disinformation and feeding into mistrust of government institutions. Ms. Urquiza said her father died from COVID-19 after heeding the advice of Mr. Trump and his enablers in the media, who dismissed the threat of violence. The media didn't pull the trigger, but they drove the getaway car, she said. Cable news channels like Fox News are complicit. When asked whether cable TV providers should be forced to stop carrying conservative-leaning outlets, the witnesses agreed that's not the answer. I don't think Congress has a role in regulating it, Ms. O'Brien said. I think news organizations should say we are here to serve the public. That is what we're supposed to do. How do we do a better job? House Minority Whip Steve Scalise, Louisiana Republican, questioned why Democrats didn't express similar levels of disgust after a gunman in 2017 opened fire on the congressional ball team, leaving him seriously wounded. The gunman was motivated by hypercharged rhetoric that he was hearing from the left, from high prominent elected officials as well as media personalities, said Mr. Scalise, holding up a report from the FBI. I don't blame these other people, I blame the shooter. The shooter is the one who should be held accountable. Mr. Scalise called on his colleagues to be consistent with their outrage and try not to suggest disingenuously that it only comes from one side of the political spectrum. Despite the blowback, Representative Michael Doyle, Pennsylvania Democrat, said the media industry should be examined. The free speech protects the freedom of the press, and the First Amendment protects the freedom of the press and freedom of speech, and the freedom of speech encourages us to ask tough questions about what is going on in the media. What is motivating the tidal wave of disinformation that is putting the lives of so many Americans and ultimately our democracy at risk, Mr. Doyle said. Partisanship and polarization in the media has been building for years, but these most recent events represent a frightening escalation, he said. And I mean, he's a Democrat, but he's right on that, and at the same time, he's also a little off base on that, but I'll get into that probably tomorrow, as there are other articles that I have on there. Leave a comment below as to your take on the media hearings. Also, so let me know if you think that there is a bias in the media, and I'll see you in the next video. There's a little more fallback from the House's hearing on fake news in the media. This coming from BizPack Review says, ex-Facebook executive calls for deplatforming conservative news outlets like OANN and Newsmax. Former Facebook executive Alex Stamos said in an interview with CNN's Brian Stelter, brazenly called for conservative news alternatives OANN and Newsmax to be deplatformed on Sunday. The media and Facebook are no longer hiding behind such terms as right-wing zealots. Now they simply label them conservatives. The segment called for the managing of what information Americans are allowed to see and hear in order to adjust their thinking and opinions. Stamos said we have to turn on the capability of these conservative influencers to reach these huge audiences. He pointed out that some of the outlets have audiences larger than CNN. There are people on YouTube, for example, that have a larger audience than daytime CNN. He added, as CNN spy and Stelter nodded in agreement. Stamos compared with Republicans in Congress to ISIS supporters, and he proposes that in some ways they can be handled as such. We're going to have to figure out the OANN and the Newsmax problem. You know, that these companies have freedom of speech, but I'm not sure we need Verizon, AT&T, Comcast, and such should be bringing them into the tens of millions of homes, Stamos declared, suggesting that the conservative news outlets be banned by cable TV carriers. This is allowing people to seek out information if they want to, but not pushing it in their faces. I think is where we're going to have to go here. Stamos was a chief security officer at Facebook until August 2018. He advised that freedom of the press is being abused by bad actors that have an economic interest in becoming more and more radical. Stamos said that Fox News fell in popularity because it introduced realism into its reporting, and that OANN and Newsmax outflanked Fox on the right, allowing viewers to put themselves in the sealed ecosystem. That becomes a huge challenge of figuring out. How do you bring those people back into the mainstream of fact-based reporting and try to get us all back into the same consensual reality, Stamos said. Stamos is calling for collaboration between social media companies and law enforcement in the manner that helped stop ISIS recruitment on their platforms after he joined Facebook in 2015. But Stamos, who is currently director of the Stanford Internet Observatory, added that ISIS did not have a domestic constituency in the United States Congress. There's over half of the Republicans in Congress who voted to overturn the election, and there will be continued public pressure on the companies to not take it seriously, Stamos argued. That's when he called for removing violent extremists, then to turn on the capability of conservative influencers to reach large audiences. The people on YouTube, for example, that have a larger audience than daytime CNN, and they are extremely radical and pushing extremely radical views, Stamos said. So it's up to the Facebooks and YouTubes in particular to think about whether or not they want to be effective cable networks for disinformation. Just a reminder that neither CNN, AT&T, or Comcast have answered any questions about why they beam channels like OANN and Newsmax into millions of homes, CNN media reporter Oliver Darcy said. Do they have second thoughts about distributing these channels, given their election denialism content? They won't say. Fox contributor Lisa Booth questioned Darcy on the measures he was calling for via Twitter. Oliver, this is just wrong to try to get them shut down. What kind of totalitarian society are you cheering on? CNN recently had to settle a big lawsuit for getting the facts wrong. Is this really a fair game to play? Author Tim Kearney asked whether CNN's pressuring of cable carriers to drop competitors might be considered a violation of antitrust law. Former California congressional candidate Beatrice Cardenas asked Darcy, who are you to demand censorship of the freedoms of the press, psycho? Owen Pawn, director of North Macedonia's International Republican Institute, posited that Stamos and CNN want to return to a simpler time when the establishment was the gatekeeper of truth. Pennsylvania engineer Pete Finnegan said the simpler time might be a fiction more dystopian one, as in George Orwell's 1984. The discussion on CNN perhaps heralds a new call for the fairness doctrine to be reimposed. It calls for so-called equality in news distribution. In 1985, the FCC released a report stating that the doctrine hurt the public interest and violated the free speech rights of broadcasters guaranteed by the First Amendment. Democrats have been trying to resurrect it ever since, and that is so true. As a matter of fact, they have been shut down many times over it, and that's why we do have people like, well, had Rush Limbaugh, and why we have people like Mark Levin, Sean Hannity, you know, Glenn Beck, and others on the conservative right who are actually countering what CNN, NBC, and CBS are saying. But one thing that the American Thinker says is we must boycott the Gaslight media and save America. This by Steve McCann over at American Thinker. There is one major lesson that conservatives and frankly all Americans must learn. Never accept at face value the reporting of any news event. By foolishly acquiescing to the version of a media or of a story put out by the denizens of the mainstream media, The citizenry allows a willing oligarchy to set the narrative and exploit the inevitably fabricated incidents that further their cause. In place of mainstream media, they ought to be called gaslight media, for their role is not to report the truth, but rather to manipulate the public into a mental state conducive to obedience. As defined medically, gaslighting is a form of psychological abuse, where a person or group makes someone question their sanity, perception of reality, or memories. People experience gaslighting often feel confused, anxious, and unable to trust themselves. These statists are unaware that once their version of a story has been repeated ad nauseum for days or weeks, the bulk of the populace will accept it as the truth, thus achieving near permanent status in the national discourse. Every quasi-totalitarian movement in modern history has employed a gaslight arm to further their aims and manipulate the masses. What was once a respected vehicle of news gathering and reporting the gaslight media is now the full-throated disinformation ministry of the left-wing ruling oligarchy. The most common threat throughout the history of those determined to achieve societal and governmental hegemony is the unabashed utilization of falsehoods that will aid in achieving their ends. The simple fact of the matter is the left lies. All who pledge fealty to any form or to any version of Marxism-socialism lie. Bootlickers currying favor from the ruling entities lie. Lying is a foundational principle of totalitarianism. A corollary of that principle is the deliberate misreporting of events to give voice to those lies. A recent example of this tactic is the reporting of the immediate days following the breach of the Capitol on January 6th of this year. The incident was almost instantaneously characterized as an armed insurrection. 5 people were said to have been murdered in the mayhem. Supposedly, a policeman was savagely beaten to death with a fire extinguisher by a Trump supporter, and this was widely reported in the New York Times and throughout the media. All the so-called insurgents were bannered by Trump supporters, i.e. domestic terrorists, or as Trump supporters, i.e. domestic terrorists, who were incited by President Trump's speech to go on a murderous rampage and threaten the lives of senators and representatives. President Trump had blood on his hands, therefore impeachment and a permanent sanction against his seeking the presidency in the future was an absolute necessity. The silence and thus tacit acquiescence by the Republican Party hierarchy and establishment conservatives to these outrageous allegations was deafening as they began to take on a life of their own. Yet how difficult was it to make even a modest effort to accurately report on the events if the gaslight media had chosen to do so, and for the Republican Party leadership and conservative establishment to not immediately cower in a corner? I attended the Stop the Steal rally in Washington, D.C. As I chose to stay in the vicinity of the Capitol rather than walk the nearly 2 miles to the ellipse where President Trump was speaking, I witnessed firsthand the breach of the Capitol. I wrote about the experience in my initial takeaway the next morning and published the article in American Thinker. Since the initial reporting, the truth has slowly leaked out, primarily through the alternative media. We now know, 1, that the FBI and other agencies, as well as congressional leaders, were aware prior to the riot that militant and extremist groups were planning to cause chaos and reach the Capitol. Thus, President Trump could not have incited the mayhem. 2, that no one was murdered by the demonstrators, and Officer Sicknick was not killed by a Trump supporter with a fire extinguisher, but died of natural causes or exposure to tear gas. Number 3, that 3 of the people supposedly murdered died of natural causes inside the Capitol building. Number 4, that there was no armed insurrection, as no one had been charged with using a firearm inside the Capitol. Further, no demonstrator has been identified as even carrying a gun inside the building. And number 5, the congressional leaders, primarily Nancy Pelosi, deliberately tied the hands of the Capitol Hill police and refused to call in additional police support or the National Guard. But the initial story by the gaslight media set the narrative, and narratives in due course evolve into unquestioned and irrefutable facts, if not immediately and aggressively questioned or refuted. Over the past 5 years, the examples of the gaslight media lies and manipulation in order to establish a false narrative, as well as a failure of conservatives and Republicans to aggressively counter the narrative, are legion. There was the Russian collusion fairy tale wherein Donald Trump was the evil turncoat who sold out his country to Vladimir Putin in order to win the 2016 election. Virtually no elected Republican or establishment conservative pushed back against this absurdity. Thus, for 3 years, that fable led to daily breathless revelations on the nightly news and front pages hamstringing the Trump administration. All those involved in the deception, including the gaslight media, knew the story was false and defamatory, but persisted irregardless as they succeeded in convincing a sizable plurality of Americans that Donald Trump was a traitor. To this day, nearly half of all Americans believe Trump was in league with Russia to steal the 2016 election, despite all the investigations and exonerations. In the spring of 2020, the Gaslight media seized on the death of George Floyd, a career criminal, to bludgeon the American citizenry with uncorroborated stories of police brutality and so-called systemic racism. While the paramilitary brigades of the left, Antifa and Black Lives Matter, were burning down cities and looting businesses, the media was lavishing praise and excusing their behavior, calling the demonstrators mostly peaceful. At the same time, the Gaslight media has unabashedly undertaken the mission of convincing 70% of the population that they are guilty of being inherently racist and therefore must surrender to the demands placed on them by the left on behalf of the ruling oligarchy. Cowardly succumbing to racial blackmail, many corporations slavishly poured untold millions into the coffers of America's left-wing domestic terrorists, further emboldening them in their militant ambitions. But as the media had framed the entire sorry spectacle around race, few on the right spoke out, questioning the veracity of the reporting as the ruling oligarchy became more entrenched while livelihoods were crushed and innocent people murdered. At the beginning of the Chinese coronavirus, before any facts were known or serious medical investigations began, mass panic was induced by the Gaslight media running around the country touting theoretical studies claiming millions of Americans would die if the citizenry did not crawl into a bunker and shut down the economy. Despite the obvious irrationality of that premise, very few on the right or the Republican Party pushed back. For the first time in the history of mankind, a society decided to quarantine the healthy instead of the sick. The fearmongers were wrong, but not before they irretrievably convinced a significant majority of Americans that the Grim Reaper lurked around every corner. But more importantly, they utilized this fear and attended lockdowns to destroy the Trump economy and set up a mechanism to manipulate the 2020 election in order to defeat their nemesis. The financial and emotional damage to the average American be damned. This nation is at a crossroads. The left-ruling oligarchy dominates nearly all societal institutions, but they cannot succeed in their effort to transform this nation's political system into a one-party oligarchy without the active role of the Gaslight media. Therefore, all thinking Americans must stop accepting at face value any reporting on any issue originating from this cabal. There must be constant and unremitting pushback by the bulk of the conservative movement and Republican elected officials to immediately question the premise and details of any story. The time has come for us to set the narratives, not the Gaslight media. And that's exactly what Andrew Breitbart had mentioned when he said that the new media is taking over where the old media failed. You know, I mean, Andrew Breitbart was a standard bearer, and you know, we definitely need to do what we can to push back against the left. And last week I had mentioned that we had lost one person in that fight, and you know, I mean, I can't believe it's been a week, but a week later there are some hints and even more tributes are coming in. This tribute from the ARRA News Service, aka Arkansas GOP Wing. This is Losing an American Genius by Victor Davis Hanson. Rush Limbaugh created modern national talk radio as we now know it from nothing. Over three decades, he kept at rapt attention weekdays, live from noon to 3, the largest conservative audience in broadcast history. Over 15 million tuned in each week. Last week, 32 years and over 23,000 hours of on-air commentary after Rush went national in August 1998, he is gone at 70 years young. By the 1990s, he became the voice, literally and iconically, of the conservative movement, and his hot-cold relations were liaisons with the Republican Party. Rush was hated by the left because he was deadly effective in fighting them and feared at times by the Republican establishment because he could also be deadly effective in fighting them. Limbaugh had an uncanny sense of what conservative populism could do, such as abruptly end Barack Obama's control of Congress after just 2 years, and the sweeping Tea Party midterm election of 2020, and he also instinctively sensed that what it should not do, and Louis Ross Perot's quixotic third-party search of 1992 that would eventually split the conservative vote and ensure Bill Clinton the presidency with just 43% of the popular vote. Rush was a master comedian. His pauses, intonations, and mock tones were far funnier than those of our contemporary regulars on late night television comedy. He was a gifted mimic, an impersonator with as wide a repertoire and skill at impressions as masters of the past like Ron Meter, David Fry, and Rich Little. Yet Rush worked mostly behind the mic without the aid of an onstage presence. During the 2009 Republican Depression over the Obama craze, there was a lonely, much caricatured Limbaugh who revived Republicans. He famously announced, to the furor of the left and the chagrin of what within a decade would become the never Trump right, that he wanted the newly inaugurated president and his agenda to fail. At the time of such heresy, a defiant Obama was gloating over his election of consequences, veto-proof Senate, and the 79-seat Democrat majority in the House. Limbaugh was a natural impromptu public speaker, and he could rev up a crowd in the fashion of a Ronald Reagan or Donald Trump. True, he was also a natural actor, but in part because he read widely, prepped constantly, and outworked his opponents. The cheap postmortem attacks on Rush Limbaugh were as expected as they were tasteless. In his thousands of hours of live broadcast, did he, on rare occasions, say wrong things? He said that he had regretted it and often apologized for them. He certainly never took out progressive insurance, the kind of occasional triangulation with the left that wins some conservatives exemptions from the cancel culture. This week, many would have preferred to read less about what Rush Limbaugh had apologized for and more about the apologies Joe Biden never offered for his lifelong compendium of racial insensitivity and prejudicial bombast, all to be contextualized in service to his correct thinking. Rush's canon was never to talk down to or insult the base. It was natural for him because he grew up with, knew intimately, and felt most comfortable with traditional middle America. Deplorables and clingers entrusted him to stay Rush. They were assured there would never be a sudden about-face, confessional, or sellout. Rush knew how to go off with the rich, but also knew what it was like to be fired often and unemployed with the deplorable. He grew increasingly frustrated that the naive right never fully understood the mind of the left. In Groundhog Day fashion, conservatives, he felt, became shocked on cue that any means were not just necessary for the left, but ethically justified, given its ends were about global justice delivered by supposed moral superiors. For someone with a reputation for mockery, I never heard Limbaugh in private or in correspondence fixate on his enemies or blast his former friends. Mostly he laughed them off and instead turned to what he told hundreds of those who knew him. How can I help you in any way? Rush was confused by the never Trump Republican virulence. He had dutifully fought for the 4 Bush election bids. He had supported loyally their 3 terms, and he tried to empower both the failed and McCain and Romney efforts. His theory was that after the primaries were over, winning 50% of what you wanted in a general election was at least better than nothing. The amnesiac never Trumpers, he felt, not just never returned the courtesy, but also never worried that they even should have. Rush was a quintessential American success story. It is impossible to imagine any other country producing either him or his career. We are mourning for Rush, but also for ourselves who are going to miss and need him more, not less, each day that he is now silent. And that's true. I mean, I said it last week and I'll say it again. There were 2 sad days in American conservative media history. One was March 1st, 2012, when Andrew Breitbart died, and the other, February 17, 2021, when Rush Limbaugh went to that radio studio in the sky. But you know what? Even 1 week later, there are still some hints that have emerged about the future of Limbaugh's show. This from my good friend Becca Lower over at redstate.com. A week ago, Red State shared the breaking news that ditto has all across the Twitter plane had been dreading for months. Rush Limbaugh had passed away. In the wake of anyone's death, our immediate thoughts are with their loved ones and their welfare. But But in Rushbo's case, over his decades of radio broadcasting, his take on politics came to be considered by some in the Republican base, to borrow a phrase from another medium, appointment radio. Alongside great thinkers like Thomas Sowell, whom I wrote about on Tuesday, Rush served as a foundational fount to many of what where conservatism is and should stand for. You can find ample evidence of this in my colleagues' writings from the past week, which our editor strafed, linked here for easy perusal. One of those was by Mike Ford, whose focus was not just on reminiscing but what comes next. And editor Brandon Morse's piece concluded, his radio show was capable of ruining narratives, changing minds, and teaching people to think for themselves. He continued to go undefeated, and in the end, it took his own body to stop him. It turns out that even that might not stop the excellence in broadcasting network that the icon nurtured all these years. I'm a regular listener to the show, but hadn't tuned in since hearing the Sad News Wednesday. Then on Monday morning, I read that one of my colleagues, Thomas LeDuc, had dedicated the entirety of his over-the-air radio show to Rush. He posts about the shows here at Red State, but it was two comments on his piece that got me wondering about the future of Rush's show. One reader wrote in part, while guest host Merrick Stein always does a fantastic job, he was playing some of Rush's greatest hits and speaking with emotional fans. I got all choked up again. I don't know what will happen to those with those 3 hours moving forward, but hearing Rush explain how his show got the Pretender song and how Chrissie Hynde was all for it out of respect for her father, who was a ditto head. I always wondered how that happened. And another reader shared that apparently his show will remain on the air for now, using archive clips and a rotation of guest hosts. Suddenly I knew that I needed to listen to the Rush Limbaugh show that day. Monday's show, it turned out, had a very special guest, Rush's widow, Catherine. And not only did guest host Mark Stein speak to her, but she agreed to take calls from listeners, a fitting and touching memorial. She ended up remaining on air for 2 hours, in fact. During those 2 hours, audio clips of Rush were interwoven among the listeners' comments and questions and Catherine's replies. One clip included Rush talking about Rush Revere, then a new series of children's books about American history he and his wife created. There was also audio from shortly after he and Catherine read, in which Rush explained to an audience which had grown more akin to family members and fans, why he kept their relationship so close to the rest. He was a deeply private person and wanted to stay that way, he said. So at the show Monday, Stein confirmed that the program isn't going anywhere for the foreseeable future, and we'll be keeping this evolving format that includes Rush's voice. It was a smart move. On this Wednesday show, Todd Herman, another regular fill-in host, especially over the past year since Rush's cancer diagnosis, played a still relevant clip of Rush talking about why the left is so adamant about wanting to pass a $15 federal minimum wage, the motivation for nearly everything they do, to pull as many able-bodied Americans as possible into dependence on the government, has not and will not change. As Joe Cunningham wrote about his radio role model, as a fledgling news talk station employee, Rush created a model that hosts who want to be syndicated go by. He created an industry that radio hosts and stations benefit from. That won't be destroyed overnight, and it's not something that will simply collapse because he's gone. And neither, it appears, will the EIB network, the radio edifice Rush Limbaugh built brick by brick. Though it will be more than a week since Rush's passing by the time the Conservative Political Action Committee, or CPAC, gets going on Thursday, everyone in attendance will have a visible reminder of El Rushbo, as Jennifer Oliver O'Connell reported, because this year's event is being held in Orlando, Florida, thanks to the China virus. All flags on public buildings in the Sunshine State have been lowered to half staff in his honor. Thanks to Republican Governor Ron DeSantis. And there's a link to Catherine Limbaugh remembering Rush while taking calls from his fans on the February 22nd show. And that's so true. I mean, I said it, like I think I said last week, I had not listened to Rush for a good while, but I was a faithful listener to his show. As a matter of fact, I have both his books, The Way Things Ought to Be and See, I Told You So, and I've been reading them, and I will continue to read them and have them in my library all throughout. You know, rest in peace, L. Rushbo. Leave a comment below your tribute to Rush Limbaugh. If you liked him, you didn't like him, or what. Also, let me know what you think about what the media is doing, and if you like what the media is doing, if you don't like what the media is doing. And I'll see you in the next video. And that's going to do it for the news for this week. I am Mick Bulow. Again, if you like what you watch, please go ahead and hit the thumbs up button. Also subscribe and tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell an enemy or two even. And I will be back next week. Until next time, peace.